All right, guys. So, in the spirit of letting the ideas do the talking, I decided to sit down and come up with some broad stroke ideas to really get the conversation flowing of things that could actually impact the game in big ways, small ways, future, sort of future. You know what I mean? Like stuff that can be done maybe in the long term future, stuff that can be done in the short term future. So, with that being said, I'm going to list through some of these ideas, talk about why I think they could be good, or kind of justify why I think they're good to the game, in the spirit of letting you guys, talk about some of these ideas down below and hopefully just kind of get the conversation flowing about what this game could do moving forward to get it in a state that we all want. So the first one is detangle gameplay from narrative. So I understand that ultimately we all want to see the story move forward. Marvel comics, Marvel movies, like TV shows, we all are invested in the story that these characters go through. But I think Crystal Dynamics needs to start taking a gameplay focused approach more instead of having to tie everything down to the narrative. Now, as I go through these ideas, I do give narrative explanations that could work in the future for some of these ideas, but ultimately some of these ideas are just based off the gameplay and upping the gameplay factor for the fun of it, right? So I see that they're trying to do this a little bit more, whether it's with Tachyon Anomaly or Patrol Mode. The idea is giving gameplay related things without necessarily having to tie it down to a story. For Tachyon Anomaly, there wasn't some big explanation behind why we're having 4 Hulks in a party or 4 Iron Man in a party, for example. For Patrol Mode, I'm sure there'll be like a little bit of an explanation, but ultimately, you're going to the future wasteland where you just fought Maestro and it's a dead wasteland, so why are you going there, right? Ultimately, they are trying to focus more on the gameplay aspect than the narrative aspect, but it is small and, few and far between. So here's some of my broad ideas, and some of these I do come from the community. So obviously the first one is make Tachyon Anomaly a permanent feature within the game. Who cares about loading into a drop zone, a villain sector, whatever, with 4 Hulks or 4 Iron Man or 2 Iron Man, 2 Caps? Like, there really isn't a reason to care. It's pure gameplay focus, and the benefits outweigh the negatives, in my opinion. Now, I know people are gonna say the lore or the canon or whatever, but ultimately I'd rather have very good matchmaking time than care about the lore of us going into this shield base 40th time in a row, right? If this was a lore focused game, ultimately, shouldn't this base be destroyed at this point, right? Or, how many times do we really fight Abomination and Taskmaster? The lore is kind of stretched thin as it is, so why not actually stretch it to the point where it is actually beneficial for the gameplay at that point? Now, when it comes to events, I kind of like the idea of events, and I'm sure events are going to get refined and they're going to be implemented better, and there's going to be more things attached to them. But I think when we talk about events, you don't necessarily need to do a 2-week event. You could do something as small as a weekend event, right? Now, this could be tied to additional or bonus modifiers to different game modes, for example. Think of like modifiers that are tied to villain sectors or tied to drop zones or tied to vaults, for example, right? Things that could incentivize you to play these specific missions for, either the fun factor of, the modifiers that are taking place or different rewards, for example, that are happening within these different game modes. So an idea of this, I have a few ideas listed down. So an example of this, an idea of this could be that drop rates are doubled this weekend for all exotic drops in certain game modes that drop them, right? So that could be Last Avengers Standing is dropping, there's a double percentage chance. I think it's only 50%. So maybe if you hit that 50%, you get 2 exotics or 3 exotics instead of just the 1, right? Or, every villain sector has a double fireball modifier, so basically, you can run your villain sectors or you can run this game mode. And if you run a plasma build, you're essentially doing double or triple the damage based on whatever modifier they're doing, right? So one of them is incentivizing the reward structure within the game. The other is incentivizing the fun structure within the game, while obviously still giving you rewards based on the villain sector, right? So, obviously you can refine those ideas and, take them a little bit further or take them, back a little bit. But the idea is that you can either you can positively reinforce the players by going after rewards, or you can just positively reinforce the fun that the game can provide without having to run, so-and-so meta build, for example, right? Because ultimately, the problem with the game right now is that we're playing the game every day, but the stuff that they want to do takes weeks and months to build out, right? So stuff that takes place over the course of a weekend or a few days here and there, ultimately you're spicing up the gameplay, you're giving players what they want more without having to say, hey guys, this is coming with a content drop, right? Or you're not tying things necessarily to a content drop that's a few months out, right? So I think definitely doing stuff that happens more on a weekend or certain days here there, I know people talk about Midtown Monday, right, for Marvel Heroes, But instead of doing Midtown Monday with double XP until post level 50 level progression is out, why not do like Fireball Friday then, right? Where its plasma modifiers are 200% bonus when you play with a plasma build, right? I know it's kind of negating the status, the battery effect, and status effects and stuff like that. But I think there's ways to kind of, go a little crazy with the game a little bit and just let some people have some fun while we wait for some of these more, heavier content drops that do provide more substantial gameplay elements, right? And obviously, if you run a gamma build right now, you've essentially been playing at 200%. But I mean, the idea is that give players what they want, or give players stuff that they don't know they want, but try different ideas out. Try this out, try that out. Don't be afraid to throw something in on a weekend and say, hey guys, play this and see if you like it. If not, then it was only a weekend. If you do, maybe this is an idea we can build upon, right? One of the biggest things I would love to see them do is call it like a Challenge 4 weekend, where every mission on Challenge 4 has a chance of an exotic drop. Right now, Challenge 4 is only for basically like the dick measuring competition, right? You get some more materials out of it, but ultimately, you're not going into Challenge 4 unless you really want to test yourself. Now, I get that there's players in the community that want to go and test themselves, but if you tie rewards to Challenge 4, then that actually gives people to run the hardest level content, which actually could be a good indicator of where your build is going into OLTs, right? So why not say like this weekend, play Challenge 4, every mission can drop an exotic. Now just say can and not will, because I mean, you don't want every character to be exotic out by the time the weekend's over, but at least give people the opportunity to go in there, test their builds out, and have the chance to, walk away with some exotics that they could actually slot into their build if need be. And this gives a totally different experience to players who've never played Challenge 4 before, and the people that have been running Challenge 4, it gives them more incentive to go back in there and play it again. Now, when it comes to content, I think this is probably universally agreed that people know the game needs content, whether it's raids, dungeons, operations, expansions. I think people understand that the game needs content to be, kind of brought up to standard. I would say that personally, I think end game content is what's needed the most, because ultimately I feel like that's where the majority of the players are. So with that being said, here's some ideas for end game content that I think could work, obviously with some refining. So just before I say all these things, I know there's probably a few roadblocks in the way. I know manpower is a thing that, probably would stop a lot of these ideas off. But, I'm looking at these with long-term goals in mind. I'm not thinking these are coming, even this year, for example. If they were to even take some of my ideas or elements of my ideas, which I don't think they will. But regardless, I think these are ideas that would happen if they did far into the future next year, for example. So just want to put that out of the way, that I know that with some of these ideas, it's like, pie in the sky sort of situation. So here's one idea that I think reinvents the wheel a little bit. So I wrote down that dungeons, raids, and etc. don't have to be the end of a story. You can use dungeons and the dungeon-like experience to kick off a story you may want to pursue in the future. I think a lot of us are accustomed to dungeons and raids being the end of an expansion or a content drop, that I think we don't accustom it or associate it with what could be the start of a story that can span over the course of a content cycle if need to. Now, I've played World of Warcraft, I've played World of Warcraft, Star Wars The Old Republic, Destiny, The Division. Usually, a lot of the time, the raids and raid-like experiences are at the end of a content cycle to signal this big boss fight, to end that content. I think there's a way here that you can use these experiences and these game modes to actually start a story and move that forward. Now, ultimately, you are sort of cutting out those people who play the game single player. I get that. It's one of those weird things where I said the game walks the line between single player and multiplayer. But I think this is an idea that actually reinvents the wheel a little bit. And ultimately, Crystal likes to do that within this genre. Whether it's the namings or the way they go about things, they ultimately do like to kind of reinvent the wheel where sometimes they don't actually need to. I think ultimately as well, leaning into the what if side of Marvel can be good too. For anyone who doesn't read Marvel comics, for example, is only familiar with the TV shows and the movies, what if are kind of different scenarios that could have happened if a different decision took place. One of the big ones right now, for example, is if Spider-Man never gave up the symbiote suit and he kept it on, right? That's a big story going on right now that a lot of people love. Now, obviously, I'm not saying use that one in particular, But I think if you don't necessarily need to tie everything down to the narrative that you're pushing forward right now, right? I think there's opportunities here to kind of take your story and move it in a different direction and call it the multiverse or what if mission, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's a branding associated with the multiverse or the what if stories that I think you can actually implement different game modes or gameplay things without having to tie your story down to this particular thing and then feel obligated to continue that story. There's ways here that you can move pieces around without having to feel like those you're obligated to that, which actually opens you up to a lot more possibilities than I think people or themselves even realize are possible. Now, granted, I'm sure they're probably constrained to a certain, things that happen. And because of that, I don't know if like what if missions or what if, different story set pieces are things that they could do, especially when they're trying to still build up their story to this Kree invasion. Now, this is probably something that's way off in the future. And you saw it a little bit though with like the Maestro time travel multiverse thing. Like time travel is always like one of those what if stories and stuff like that. So they do kind of borrow elements from it without totally leaning into it, which is totally cool. But I think there's ways to kind of do it there. Now, the idea that I'm going to use for the what if section actually could work both for a what if story as well as a narrative story if they so choose. And it kind of brings everything full circle in that sense. So, the what if story in my head, I'm seeing what if Bucky was still a Hydra agent after he launches, and we do an OLT that has us fight him at the end of it. Now, obviously, granted, having a Bucky that on your team as well as fighting him is a little weird. But I think if you just tie it into like a, just say multiverse and everyone's happy, essentially. But I think there's ways that you can kind of do stuff like that and have the fun factor of it. And, even just say it's like it's a tachyon thing. This is tachyon related, tachyon's this, tachyon's that. Have it done with it and just wipe it away. Now, if you wanted to do the more narrative approach to something like this, now, in my head, basically have Bucky be the start of his operation. Say you do a group mission and you go in and fight Bucky, and at the end of this, when you fight Bucky, whoever is the world first for fighting Bucky, it unlocks him for the rest of the player base. Now, this might actually upset some players within the player base, maybe the more casual players, granted, but I think you're offering a few different things here. You're offering, once again, the dungeon or the OLT experience being the start of a content cycle, which I think is still a really cool idea. You're offering the hardcore players or players who may not be involved so much in that group multiplayer experience an opportunity to fight a fan favorite character as the Winter Soldier, for example, and you're giving those players an opportunity to be world first. Now, one of the things I like about raids or raid-like experiences or stuff like that is the opportunity to be world's first. I'm a big fan of the way Destiny does it, the way they, bring the community together over a world first experience. They've done similar ideas where certain things are locked until that first group actually beats the raid. But having a character lock behind it, I know may be a very idea, but I think even if you don't do that, maybe there's something behind that gets unlocked when you beat Bucky, for example. Even if you can take Bucky in there like day one, you max him out real quick, you get the best gear for him, you take him in, done. Even if you say beat Bucky and something unlocks that is permanent over the course of the content cycle and has impact over it, I think something like that could be cool too. But if you go with the first idea that he, you unlock him and then the rest of the operation is, his revenge over Hydra, for example, I think that offers a cool narrative experience that I think they could look into. Granted, I don't know if they would look into that, for example, but it's an idea. It's an idea. So I want to talk about game modes for a little bit. Game modes and objectives and stuff like that, people much smarter than me in the community have talked to a degree that is way above my head about different ways to implement game modes, different ways to implement different objectives in game modes, and there's a lot of people who have done those kind of conversations. So I'm not going to try to get lost in the weeds on this and go into super deep detail because people have me beat here, granted. But one of the things that I see people talk about is the superhero experience not being replicated in the multiplayer like it is in the single player. Now, one of the ideas I brought up, I think it was last Friday, was that what if in some of these group-like experiences that you're in the multiplayer, you have a boss that singles out one player in the group and you're having a more one-on-one battle with this boss while the other three people are engaged in clearing ads, doing objectives, doing puzzles, whatever it so is, so that you're giving one player. Now, there's a few issues with this idea, and I'll get to that, but you're giving one player um, the ability to have that one-on-one, more single-player superhero experience, and then you're giving the three other players not just kind of damage. You're giving them objectives, you're giving them puzzles, you're giving things that make them kind of work together within that three-man unit. Now, the idea I think is solid, but there's some issues there with the execution. Obviously, if you're not one of those players, if you're not the one player that gets picked, you're probably a little upset with that. Granted, you're basically singling out one player to say, hey, you get a cool boss battle. And granted, I don't think that one player should be able to kill them in that boss battle, but basically you're basically giving that one player the opportunity to have a one-on-one fight, whereas the other three players are kind of demoted to a lesser degree. That could be an issue with that. So, but I think there's potential in kind of splitting up the group or having different group members do different things in order to give everyone a more different taste of kind of what is offered in a mission. And I think that's what the game is missing. A lot of the time it's like, go here, hit this button, do this, do that. And I think there's ways that you can split up a group in some of these more objective based game modes or some of these more mechanically intense game modes to give a different experience than just kind of like go up to a boss, it hit all your abilities, you melt them. Similar to, in rage timers or different mechanics involving the boss having invulnerability for a while, there's different ways that you can take, ideas from different games or different genres and implement them within the game. But, I'm trying to think of like 2-in-1 for this one, for example. But that's just one idea. The last idea that I just want to talk about here is that major artifacts are game changers, and I don't think they realize that yet. So when Hank Pym was first figured out, there was like a collective hype among the community about, how to get him, what he could do. And it felt like there was a race to get him. Everyone wanted those Maestro villain sectors to go get him. And I think Crystal Dynamics needs to realize one thing in particular is that not every character needs to be a hero within the game. Now, for the War Machine gang out there, I'm not singling out War Machine on this one, so don't jump at me for this one. But if we're waiting for every single character to be a part of the game in a character-focused way, we're not going to get every character. But it doesn't mean not every character can be in the game either, if you know what I mean. So I think they need to start exploring the idea of putting some of these different characters within the game as a summon. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. Now, the major characters that are within the movies, think of Falcon, Bucky, Vision, Wanda, Doctor Strange. And for the War Machine gang, we'll say War Machine. Now, granted, I think these characters should actually be full-fledged characters built out with their own movesets and so on and so forth. But I think there's an opportunity here to take some of the lesser-known characters and actually move them into a prominent role within the game and give them summons so people are actually familiar with them. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, granted, with you. But, I mean, the thing about characters and stuff is going to be very touchy, and people are going to say, like, this character should be a character and not a summon. But I think there's opportunity here, regardless of which characters make it or not, that they need to start implementing some of these things to really bring together different characters from different parts of the Avengers universe and give them a focus in the game. So in terms of going back to Hank Pym, I think one of the things about this one in particular is that the timer needs to be shortened in terms of how long it takes to resummon him, and I think the timer needs to be lengthened in how long he's actually on the field. Now, one of the things I think they could do is obviously make it a polychrome dump, like, you level it up and maybe you take it to the next stage of major artifact, and then every time you take it to the next stage, he's out there for longer and longer until you hit like a max, and the max can be whatever, but I think he's not out there for long enough, and I think they've tied it to like the buffs. And unfortunately with the buffs, I kind of get why the buffs of the are on the timer the way they are, but to have someone come out on the field, a Marvel character like that, I think there's an opportunity there to kind of either have him out there for longer or, kind of do something where you tie it into a material dump to, justify that kind of leveling up process. Another idea that could be tied together with this, for example, is that if we're getting the ability to change out how many players or AI members we want on our strike team, what if we were able to kind of take away all of our strike team members and replace it with a permanent AI that is a major artifact character? So this actually could work really well, I think, if you're doing like a status effect build and then Hank Pym is your key to unlocking the potential of your build, right? We all saw what I think it was Lejeune did with Gamma and Hank Pym. Now, obviously, there was probably a bug there, but what if there's ways that you can do that and then have different characters on top of that? So, say for example, you're playing Iron Man, and God, War Machine Gang is gonna hate me for this, but say for example, War Machine did actually become a summon. Now you could actually take all your members out, and then you could just roll with War Machine just like that, right? Now, obviously, there's probably ways that would probably break multiplayer a little bit, but maybe that's something they could look into in terms of the major artifacts and summon stuff like that, right? I don't necessarily think they have to be tied to a timer if you're taking out your strike team members, because at that point you could just roll with you and your artifact summon and just roll like that. That could be a cool thing to do as well. In terms of major artifacts, just in general, I think they need to be more active in how they interact with the game world. I think the Hank Pym one was kind of like the first cut in the cake, for example. I think honestly, right now, a lot of the ones that we have are very, buffing, and they kind of change the way our characters' stats work or whatever. But I think honestly, if I had to choose between having three that come out and change my stats and having one come out in the same time frame that's a little more interactive with the game world and more active with the way we do things, I think I'm taking the one over the three, to be quite honest with you. So I think even if the time it takes to make, very interactive major artifacts and very interactive things that interact with the way our characters play and our enemies interact with us, I think I would take the longer time, because I think there's more gameplay elements there that is more focused on the fun factor than just like, I'm popping my artifact, I get a boost, and I'm just going to do this. It's like, I get why those are simple and easy to do, obviously, but I think they lose a little bit of the fun factor without that. So, with that being said, guys, obviously these are some rough ideas, and just trying to start the spirit of conversation here. So, do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there anything of these you would refine, take out, change? Let me know in the comments below. And if you guys want to, man, on Friday I'll be live with Viewer Collins. If you want to save it for the Viewer Collins, let me know. And I look forward to talking to you guys then. All right, guys, have a good rest of your Tuesday, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.